I need you to listen to me. Do not ever ignore a warning sign when you're in nature, because if you do, your story is probably going to end up like his. And by the way, I don't mean like a subtle sign like the air shifting or the clouds darkening. I mean a literal sign. This sign right here. You know a place is bad when there's a sign deep underground with a literal Grim Reaper on it. It reads, "Prevent your death, go no farther. There's nothing in this cave worth dying for." Now, if I saw that sign, I would turn around immediately. And you would probably do the same thing. But one man, 30-year-old Ben McDaniel, well, he looked at that very sign and then went right past it. And when searchers went in after him, they came back with a mystery that was far stranger and far darker than just a man simply getting lost in a cave. That particular sign sits next to the locked gate of the cave at Vortex Spring in Florida, of all places, where the tunnels get tight, the visibility disappears, and one wrong move means that you are not making it out alive. Enough people have died there that this Grim Reaper sign isn't even over the top or overly dramatic. It's just honest. Now, if you're anything like me, cave diving already sounds like the most terrifying hobby ever invented, but there is a whole community of people out there who cave dive regularly and they love it. Maybe it's something about the risk or the challenge or the total immersive isolation, something about that stuff that pulls these people in. I don't know exactly, but I do know that Ben McDaniel was one of those people. Ben had been obsessed with scuba diving ever since he first learned about it at age 15. However, as he got older, life started to get in the way and he kind of fell off with the sport. It wasn't until his life began to completely fall apart that he was actually drawn back into it, and this time much more passionately than he had ever been. In 2010, Ben had just turned 30 and his life was kind of a mess. And I say that with the utmost compassion, but things were really not going well for him. He was going through a divorce, his business had failed, and he owed like $50,000 to the IRS. It was bad. And so his parents, trying to help, actually offered up their beach condo in Florida as a place for Ben to go and stay at for a while and take a much needed break. And this was a very thoughtful gesture from Ben's parents, but of course they had no idea that this innocent invitation would go on to change their lives forever, and not in a good way. However, if you want to change a life forever and actually do it in a good way, then please consider helping me reach 1 million subscribers. If this is your first time watching me, you can hold off for now. I'm going to do my best to earn your subscription by the end of this video. And if you're a regular viewer, double check that you're subscribed, because sometimes YouTube does some weird things. And also, you're the best. So around this time, not only was Ben going through all the things I just mentioned, but he was also mourning the tragic death of his 22-year-old brother who had died 2 years earlier. And like, my heart goes out to the entire McDaniel family, because unfortunately their story just keeps getting darker and darker from here. So after Ben moved to Florida, cave diving became a major part of his grief healing process. He felt like everything was simpler underwater. When he dove, for those brief moments, he could forget all about his life's problems and just let go. And again, while I will most definitely never go cave diving, hell, I don't even like snorkeling, I can see how it brought Ben some mental relief. I mean, it was his thing, right? We all have our thing, our hobby, our passion that we can do when we just need to like give our brains a break. For me, it's hiking and pickleball a little bit, but I'm probably better at hiking than I am at pickleball. So after spending some time in Florida and a lot of time cave diving, it seemed like things were working. Things were actually starting to turn around for Ben. His parents even said that he seemed way happier at this point than he had been for the past few years, and they could finally breathe a sigh of relief, believing that he was going to be okay. But though Ben's life might have been finally looking up, the last days before he entered that cave, well, they tell a much darker story. And one thing in particular that Ben did just before he vanished would go on to haunt his family afterwards forever. And I really mean that. Just before he left, Ben did something that seemed completely normal at the time, but would soon prove to be just incredibly disturbing. And that moment is where this story really begins to spiral. Folks, things are about to get very dark. And so before they do, I want to take a chill pill for just a moment. Like literally. I want to chill. Like, here's a shot of me in bed chilling. So do any of you guys doom scroll before bed? Don't lie, I know you do. I know that I sure do, but lately I've been doing it in a way that actually makes me some cash. And I'm not joking, by the way. I started using this app called Free Cash, who is the sponsor of today's video. It's basically a bunch of small tasks like games, surveys, things like that, and you get rewarded for doing them, which is really interesting because I was already doing all of that stuff every night before bed anyway, except back then I was doing it for free, but not anymore. Now when I'm procrastinating sleep, I'll open up Free Cash instead. I tried one of the game offers, nothing intense, you know, just something I can play without thinking too hard, and it was super fun. And by the way, no, you're not gonna retire from this. Let's just get that out of the way, but it's nice getting a little something back from time that I was already wasting on my phone anyways. The app is super simple. You pick an offer and then it tracks what you do. And once you hit the minimum, you can cash out with stuff like PayPal or gift cards. There's a ton of people using it already. The ratings are solid, which makes it feel way less sketchy. So if you want to try it out, you can use my link in the description or scan the QR code and you're going to get a $10 bonus after your first offer. I'm going to keep using it here and there, mostly as an excuse to stay up later than I probably should. So one more time, click that link and get ready because this story is about to get really crazy. On August 15th, 2010, only 3 days before his fateful dive, Ben returned to Florida from a week-long trip to Memphis. He was there visiting his parents, and shortly after he departed, his parents discovered that he had left something behind for them. It was a note. And it talked about how grateful Ben was that they had let him stay in their Florida house and that he would be there to take care of them as they got older. He really sounded like a great son, a son who was finally getting back on his feet after some of the hardest years of his entire life. But when Ben's parents, Shelby and Patty, when they said goodbye to him after this trip, they had no idea about the hell that they were about to find themselves in. They also had no idea that they would never see their son again. So let me introduce you to Vortex Spring in Ponce de Leon, Florida. It's a huge freshwater spring famous for its underwater cave system. And even though it's known for being deadly, hence the sign you saw at the beginning of this video, cave divers flock there to explore its narrow passageways. And honestly, I'm guessing that the danger is a huge part of the appeal for, you know, the more adventurous members of the cave diving community. And once again, Ben was one of those divers who was willing to tempt his fate for a chance to dive deeper than anyone else wanted to go. By August of 2010, Ben was a regular at Vortex Spring. He had gone down into the shallower parts of the cave many times, and all without incident. He was even known by employees and other divers at this point. I mean, he was really there all the time. And of course, this was mostly due to the fact that Ben just really loved cave diving, but also due to the fact that he had aspirations of opening his own diving business one day. Now, Wednesday, August 18th, it started normally enough for Ben. It was a low-key morning before heading over to Vortex Spring for his first dive of the day. And that was not a mistake. He actually had 2 dives planned on this particular day. The first was going to be a bit of a reconnaissance mission to kind of scope out the area for his second dive, when he would actually go down deep inside this deadly cave. 2 of the Vortex Spring dive shop employees, Eduardo Terran and Chuck Cronin, watched as Ben suited up for his first dive. He zipped up his wetsuit, he secured his air and decompression tanks, he put his face mask on, and it's important to note that Eduardo and Chuck thought of Ben as a little bit of a bragger, perhaps an overly confident diver. However, they also understood that he was just a guy who was incredibly passionate about diving. Ben shot the pair a quick wave before he slipped under the water's surface. The moment he submerged, the entire world went quiet, and Ben could think clearly in a way that he just couldn't do while on dry land. The water was also a nice break from the 90-degree heat outside. This is Florida after all. And so after descending off of the dock and into the Springs Basin, Ben made his way down and over to one side of the freshwater pool. Here, he would have found the opening that marked the very beginning of the 1,642-foot long cave. Like, wow. Ben swam into this opening and the world around him instantly fell into darkness. He clicked on the light that was attached to his helmet, and he might have even felt something slither past his legs, since this cave was apparently known for housing a population of eels, which is yet another reason why cave diving will not be found on my bucket list, by the way. However, some stupid eel would not be stopping Ben, who was, again, the type of person that would push ahead no matter what, even to a fault sometimes. Eventually, Ben passed some of the cave's early landmarks, like 2 diving training platforms at around 20 feet deep. The water got colder as he continued down, and eventually he had to swim his way through an opening of about 9 by 12 feet, and things would only get more narrow from here on out. Like, he hadn't even gotten to the truly dangerous part yet, but I mean, I can't even imagine at this point. You're underwater, you're going through small openings, it's pitch black, and it only gets worse because by this point, Ben started to come up on the weirdest and the creepiest part of this entire cave. If you're an inexperienced diver, the furthest that you're permitted to go is 115 feet into the cave system. However, if you're a more like intermediate level diver like Ben was, you're allowed to keep going for about another 200 feet, which of course is exactly what Ben did. But then, about 310 feet into the cave, Ben reached a dead end. It was here that Ben swam right up to a passageway that was blocked by a steel-locked gate. And right next to this passageway and this gate was that warning sign with the literal Grim Reaper on it. There's nothing in this cave worth dying for. Do not go beyond this point. And again, this sign is obviously very dramatic, but I promise you that it's not just there for show or for photos or whatever. They had very, very good reason for this sign to exist, because back in the 90s, 13 people died while diving at the Vortex Spring Cave. Now, I've covered many stories on this channel about people who ignored warning signs, but to all of those other victims' credit, they never ignored a sign like this, right? The signs that they ignored were either smaller and less dramatic, or they were more subtle signs, you know, maybe not even actual signs. I have never seen a warning sign this explicit or this intense. It absolutely freaked me out the first time I saw it, and I'm genuinely not trying to be disrespectful to Ben here, but I just cannot imagine seeing this sign and then thinking it was a good idea to go past it. Like, anyways, like I said a second ago, next to this ominous sign was this locked gate. And Ben would have known about all of this, by the way. He would have known that it was locked. He would have known that he couldn't go any further. And he also would have known that in order to get a key to unlock this gate, you actually needed a special diving certification that required over 2 months of training and 125 dives with a trained instructor. And the problem was that though Ben did have a decent amount of diving experience, he didn't have any formal diving training, and he definitely did not have that certification. If he had, then maybe everything that was about to happen could have been avoided, and I wouldn't even be making this video right now. Since Ben was a pretty decent diver, and he was also incredibly headstrong and perhaps a little bit overconfident in his abilities, something like this silly Grim Reaper warning sign that said you would literally die if you kept going, well, that didn't scare him off. Maybe he even took the sign and the locked gate as a bit of a challenge, and maybe it made him even more determined to keep swimming. Now, that's me editorializing, to be perfectly clear, but it does make me wonder. While Ben was floating there next to the cave entrance, he mapped out the deeper dive that he planned to take later that night. Since everyone knew that Ben didn't have the right certifications for this cave, it would be a lot easier to go unnoticed if he went after the spring had kind of cleared out later in the day and there weren't really many people around. However, Ben was maybe not quite as sly as he thought he was, because several people saw him diving that afternoon and they knew exactly what he was up to. They knew that he planned to break into the locked area later that night somehow. In fact, some people had suspicions that he had already been making progress towards breaking into that lock, but I'll get there in a second. Once Ben was done mapping things out, he made his way back up to the surface, making sure to follow the proper decompression procedures so he wouldn't get sick. The 2 dive shop employees, Eduardo and Chuck, watched as a mass of bubbles appeared on the water. And then a few moments later, Ben resurfaced, pulling himself out of the spring's basin, and he started stripping off all of his heavy gear. Now, he would take some time to regather his strength, take a little bit of a rest, and refill his tanks. Just like everyone else who had seen him that day, Eduardo and Chuck knew that Ben didn't have the right certifications to enter the cave, but they also knew that there really wasn't that much they could do to prevent him from going into the cave, right? They had even started to suspect that he had actively been picking the gate's lock in order to one day let him in. It almost reminds me of like a prisoner who like tunnels a little bit every night before finally busting out. It was clear to the employees that Ben was going to do whatever he wanted to do, and for whatever reason, he really wanted to push himself as far as his body would allow. He really wanted to explore that mysterious cave. Warning signs be damned. As I said earlier, a lot of people would describe Ben as being a cocky diver, but I do want to offer a more sympathetic perspective on him. Ben's dad, Shelby, well, he saw it like this. Ben was someone who had found his great passion in life and would not let anything stop him from pursuing it. And I have a lot of sympathy for Ben's father's viewpoint here. I mean, maybe losing his son, Paul, at such a young age meant that him and his wife would do whatever it took to support Ben. I'm sure that they weren't thrilled about Ben's obsession with cave diving. I mean, what parent would be? But they also didn't want to do anything that was going to push him away. After all, I mean, this was the happiest that they'd ever seen him since his brother's death, and so why would they want to criticize the one thing that had finally brought Ben some joy? Back at Vortex Spring, an exhausted Ben was resting on the shore, writing in his dive book and just regaining his strength for his next dive. On Vortex Spring's security cameras, Ben was even captured refilling his air tank. As the day went on, more and more people began to leave the spring and head home, but of course, that did not include Ben. He waited around the spring, killing time, and eventually he even called his mother. Now, I'm not exactly sure what they talked about, but I am sure that despite the fact that no one realized it, this would be the last time that Ben would ever speak to his family. After he hung up with his mother, Ben suited up once again, and he got in the water. It was now around 7:30 p.m., and as Ben was getting ready to dive, Eduardo and Chuck were making their way out of the water after a dive of their own. The men greeted Ben, and they asked him if he was going to go down again. Ben may have tried to play it cool, but I mean, all three of them knew exactly what he was doing. I mean, the guy was fully geared up, and he even had a helmet on with a light on it. He was clearly going to the cave, even though all three of them knew that he wasn't correctly trained for it. Eduardo in particular had long suspected that Ben was trying to pick and break the lock at the entrance of the cave, and so against his better judgment, he actually decided to do Ben a solid and go unlock the gate for him. He figured it was safer than Ben trying to break in and then squeeze past the gate and potentially get himself stuck, and it would also help to avoid any further damage to the lock and to the gate. So Eduardo put his mask back on and swam down to the cave entrance. Ben took the last breath of fresh air that he would ever take before putting on his diving mask and slipping into the water for a final time. Eduardo unlocked the gate, and he watched Ben swim right past the warning sign, right into the cave, and then fade into the darkness. Eduardo then returned to the surface, completely unaware that he had just witnessed the last moment that Ben would ever be seen dead or alive. Now, Ben was in the habit of staying pretty late at the spring, and most nights Eduardo and Chuck would stick around the dive shop until they noticed that he was about to resurface safely, and then they would go home. But on this particular night, for whatever reason, they actually deviated from that routine. Maybe they were sick of waiting on Ben. Maybe they were fed up with him bending their rules. Maybe it was something else entirely. I don't know why, but Eduardo and Chuck decided instead of waiting, they were going to go back to Eduardo's house for a cup of coffee. And to be fair, they had every right to do this. It's not like they were responsible for Ben's actions. It is just unfortunate, though, especially looking back, because if they had stuck to their normal routine, then the next series of events I'm about to tell you about might have gone a whole lot differently. Now, a lot can go wrong while cave diving, obviously, but these days, most cave diving deaths happen because someone was inexperienced. As I've told you a few times, Ben had a pretty good amount of experience diving, and he had been doing it kind of off and on since he was 15, so like half of his life. But despite this experience, he technically was never properly certified or trained for cave diving specifically. We almost certainly will never know exactly what happened down there, but we do know that something went terribly wrong because come Thursday morning, Ben's truck was still in the Springs parking lot, and the next day it was still there too. This was right in the middle of the busy summer season, and so it wasn't until 9 a.m. on Friday, August 20th, like a day and a half after Ben made that dive, that his abandoned truck was finally noticed. Eduardo actually noticed that it was parked there, and then he realized that he hadn't seen Ben since Wednesday night when he unlocked the gate for him. And that struck him as incredibly unusual. He knew that it meant something was seriously wrong, and so he ran into the dive shop and he called the Holmes County Sheriff's Office. And with that call, folks, the rescue mission to find the missing Ben McDaniel was on. As soon as the police arrived, Vortex Spring essentially became a crime scene and was taped off. Captain Harry Hamilton was put in charge of the investigation, and even though he didn't have any answers yet, he knew that he had to let Ben's parents know what was going on. He needed to tell two already grieving parents that they might have just lost a second child. When a neighbor called the McDaniels to let them know that a sheriff's deputy was at their gates, Patty McDaniel immediately knew something horrible had happened. She tried to walk to the front door, but her legs collapsed out from under her, and so Shelby answered the door instead. He answered to the officer, and the officer told the parents that Ben had gone diving 2 nights ago and no one had seen him since. And with that horrible realization, Ben's parents didn't even need a second to decide what they were going to do next. They were going to Florida right now to help look for him. I mean, losing one son was unimaginable, so losing two, well, I mean, that was just beyond anything they could comprehend. And so this meant that they were ready to do whatever it took to find their son. Though tragically, this drive for answers might have indirectly caused a different tragedy of its own, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We're gonna get there. Back at Vortex Spring, Captain Hamilton and his team had wrapped up their initial search of the area by August 20th. They hadn't found Ben or his body yet, but they did find some of his personal effects. In his abandoned truck, they found his wallet with $1,100 in cash. They also found his cell phone, his dive log, which happened to have a map of the cave, by the way. And now would be a good time to note Ben's size. He was 6'1" and weighed between 210 and 220 pounds. And that might seem like some random information to be giving you, but it is a very important part of this story. Ben was obviously a bigger guy and not someone who could easily just disappear or, say, fit into tiny cave openings, especially ones that even most smaller people couldn't even fit into. Captain Hamilton was holding out hope that the diving team would have some good news for Ben's parents. I mean, the best case scenario would be that Ben had gotten stuck in a small space, but was in a large enough underwater air pocket to survive until the rescue team could reach him. Or maybe he was somewhere on land, alive, but hurt, and he couldn't walk himself back to his car. However, by the end of the day on August 20th, rescue divers met with the sheriff's office to debrief, and they had no good news to share. The only thing they had found were these strangely placed air tanks that were set in spots that should have been easier to access, as well as more evenly spaced along the cave. And even weirder, the tanks had the wrong type of gas in them. They had standard air, or they were completely empty, instead of containing the specialized decompression mix expected for a dive like this. And so as midnight neared, there was still no sign of Ben. Captain Hamilton was starting to lose hope, and he had decided that they needed to pause recovery for the next day. He still had no idea where Ben was, but one thing was becoming clear. Ben must have gone even deeper into the cave than anyone thought possible. More days continued to go by, still with no answers, but Captain Hamilton was pushing ahead with the search anyways. He knew that he needed to find divers who were specialized in reaching the further depths of these deep cave systems. He needed to call in the best of the best, a man named Ed Sorensen. By this point, everything in the search and the mystery had just gotten so complicated. The question was no longer just whether or not Ben had died. It was whether or not he had even been or died in the cave in the first place. And if anyone was going to be able to answer that question, it was Ed. Ed was the area's go-to rescue diver, but he had been away when Ben first went missing on the 18th. However, now, on August 22nd, he was back in town, and it just so happens that he was willing to go where almost nobody else was. When the news first got out that Ed was going to dive down and look for Ben, he received a flurry of calls from other divers who had also looked for Ben on previous search missions. One diver told him, quote, "Nobody without training could have gone farther than I got." Another diver told him that he had almost died down there, just like Ben, presumably, which wasn't exactly a vote of confidence before embarking on a dangerous dive, but regardless, Ed decided to move ahead with the planned search. 4 days after Ben was last seen, Ed suited up with the smallest air tanks he could find, so that he could fit through the narrower parts of the cave. He then submerged himself and began following the same path that Ben had followed 4 days earlier. He brought an underwater scooter with him, which I guess helped propel him forward so he could move more quickly, but he soon abandoned it when the tunnel got too small. Approximately 1,700 feet into the cave, Ed reached the end of what was mapped. And because the tunnel was so narrow in this particular area, if someone, i.e. Ben, had made it past that point, then there would have been markings on the cave's limestone walls. There would have been a sign that he or someone had been there. But instead, Ed saw nothing. Not a single marking, not one scratch on the limestone, not one sign of human life anywhere. This did not make sense to Ed. He was not only shorter than Ben, but also around 20 pounds lighter. And so Ed was at a complete loss and couldn't give any answers to Captain Hamilton once he resurfaced. Things just didn't make sense. I mean, there was no way that Ben could have fit anywhere that Ed couldn't have. And again, he couldn't find any signs that Ben was still down there trapped, let alone that anyone had ever been down there before. Ed had this to say, quote, "The last place I searched was pristine without a mark that a diver had been there. It would be impossible to go through that restriction without making a mark on the floor or ceiling. He's not in there." And fair enough, but if Ben wasn't in the cave, then where the hell could he possibly be? I mean, all signs point to him having drowned down there, but if that were true, then why was his body nowhere to be found? If Ben went in the cave should show it, and yet there was nothing. The underwater searches during the first few days didn't find anything, clearly, but the above water investigations did yield one very confusing piece of evidence. During the initial investigation, the sheriff's office had sent 2 cadaver dogs to the area, which would alert if they smelled any signs of decomposition. The dogs sniffed around the dive shop, the shore, the water, and then sure enough, each dog ended up alerting, once along the bank and then once at the water. And this seemed like a very promising lead. However, when the lab tested the water from the spring, the results were very confusing. Of the 30 tests conducted on the water, not one of them tested positive for the bacteria produced by a decomposing body. And so, who was wrong? The cadaver dogs or the lab? This is a prime example of the frustration in this case. I mean, every time they made some sort of headway, investigators immediately ran into another wall. Days turned into weeks, and before anyone knew it, over a month had gone by without any sign of finding Ben dead or alive. By late September, 36 days had passed since Ben had last been seen, but the Holmes County Sheriff's Office wasn't ready to give up yet. In those 36 days, 16 divers went out to search. They continued to go down into the cave, but at the same time, the investigators were kind of shifting their attention. They were starting to take a closer look into who Ben actually was and what was going on in his life at the time of his disappearance. And I touched on some of this stuff earlier, but Ben had gone through a lot in the past few years with his brother's death, his divorce, his failed business, among plenty of other things. When his parents offered up their beach condo, Ben was in a really bad place mentally. Those closest to him said he was like incredibly depressed. And that particular fact had Captain Hamilton wondering if Ben had actually gone into the cave, never actually intending to come out. Captain Hamilton asked Ed Sorensen what he thought of this theory, and Ed told Captain Hamilton that it was a possibility that maybe Ben had gone further than Ed was willing to go, and that Ben had squeezed himself into a tight spot that he knew he couldn't get himself out of. But at the same time, Ed wasn't exactly buying this theory either. I mean, there would have been evidence that Ben had been that deep in the cave, and there just wasn't any, right? And also, people who knew Ben at the time of his disappearance had seen a change in him. I talked about this earlier. Ben no longer seemed as hopeless or as depressed as he had been after his brother's death. Things were looking up for him, and he had even started to make some plans for the future. The theory that he took his own life, it just wasn't adding up, and so investigators needed to look into other possible explanations. If he didn't die in that cave, and if he didn't go there to end his life, they started to wonder if Ben had actually even made that second dive at all. There were some small pieces to the story that just didn't really line up. For instance, the decompression tanks found in the cave were placed in an odd position and not where you'd expect them to be for a dive like this. And again, some of them had the wrong gas entirely. And there was also Ben's dive log to consider. Ben had a notebook that he had been using to draw his own map of the cave, but when divers familiar with the cave took a look at this map, things didn't really add up. Some notations didn't match the cave's actual layout. Individually, those things could be written off, of course, but combined together, well, they raised a bigger question. What if those weren't mistakes, but rather planned misdirections? Investigators started to consider whether Ben may have staged the entire dive, that he left the tanks and the map to make it look like he had gone deep into the cave, when in reality, he had actually turned around quickly and then kind of ran off. And as far-fetched as that theory sounds, it would explain why no trace of him was ever found deep in the cave. The theory speculates that Ben had run away to start a new life somewhere, and he was still alive out there somewhere, living off the radar. And similar to the theory that he took his own life, investigators wondered if maybe he just couldn't take it anymore and didn't want to repay his debts. He just wanted a fresh start. However, Ben's parents just couldn't believe that he would have done that to them. I mean, Ben knew the pain that losing one son had caused his parents, and so why would he put them through that for a second time, deliberately? Not to mention, he would have had to leave his girlfriend and his dog, by the way, who had been left alone in his house without any access to food, which is really sad. And so putting that theory aside, there was actually some new leads that were coming to light, and they gave way to another theory. What if Ben never made his second dive, but not by choice? What if Ben had been met with foul play? There was some evidence that supported this theory, very loose evidence. Apparently, a fight had broken out at the Vortex Spring the day that Ben went missing, and witnesses remembered seeing a diver arguing with some drunk teenagers. And so could that diver have been Ben? And what if those teenagers had been so mad that they came back later that day to finish the fight, and the confrontation ended with Ben's death? And look, I know what you're thinking. How is it that a few drunk, or at the very least hungover teenagers could somehow pull off a murder and leave zero evidence behind? I mean, does that sound at all like something in the wheelhouse of high school boys? I agree. I'm not exactly convinced. And besides, no one even confirmed whether or not Ben was the diver that was involved with this fight anyways. But there was also the wild-eyed man who seemed drunk that the owner of Vortex Springs saw arrive at the dive shop after sunset on the evening that Ben disappeared. Could this guy have had anything to do with Ben's disappearance? And again, drunk people, they are unpredictable, but they aren't exactly known for their subtlety and their ability to pull off flawless crimes, and so I'm not really sure about that theory either. Desperate for answers, Ben's parents went so far as to hire a private investigator, but unfortunately, that didn't yield any results. And so the foul play theory wasn't really adding up because there were zero signs of a struggle at the bank of the spring. The dive shop's cameras didn't show anything suspicious, and Ben's wallet was found with all of the money still inside of it in his truck, which didn't make sense for like a robbery gone wrong. Oh, and speaking of money, things in this case were somehow actually able to get even darker because some pretty serious money was about to get involved with Ben's search, and this would take the story in an entirely new direction. It was now April, 8 months since Ben had disappeared, and Shelby and Patty McDaniel, well, they were running out of options. So much time had passed, and yet every potential lead was met by another dead end. But Shelby and Patty were still willing to do anything to find their son, and so they announced a $10,000 reward for the diver who could find him. But tragically, just like every other thing they had tried up to this point, it didn't work. Almost a year passed with zero new clues. And so in March of 2012, a year and a half after Ben's disappearance, they increased the reward to $30,000. And to be frank, this pissed off many members of the diving community, especially because Ben's parents had said that they would award the money to divers who were, quote, brave enough to find Ben. And while you and I might not see a problem with that, experienced divers didn't see the search for Ben as brave anymore. They saw it as reckless, and they resented the McDaniels' willingness to put others' lives at risk in order to find their son. They didn't want people going out and risking their own lives to try to get that money. Now, I doubt that the McDaniels saw it that way. I'm certain they weren't trying to hurt anyone else, obviously, but let's just say that the diving community might have been onto something, because the situation at Vortex Spring was about to get a lot worse. On March 17th, 2012, only days after the McDaniels increased the reward to $30,000, a diver deep in the cave noticed another solo diver. At first, it looked like this solo diver was just kind of taking a break, but upon closer inspection, they noticed that the diver was not moving. He wasn't breathing either. In fact, there was no life behind his eyes. He was dead, and right next to him was a shovel. This diver was soon identified as Larry Higginbotham, and because of the fact that he was diving in the cave by himself with a shovel only days after the reward had increased, well, many people in the diving community assumed that Larry had been down there searching for Ben, chasing the money, chasing this $30,000. And now, to be clear, this was never proven. It is just an assumption, but out of an abundance of caution, Larry's death prompted the McDaniels to pull their reward anyways. They wanted to find their son, of course, but another life was just too high of a price to pay for the answers that they desperately sought. Ben McDaniel's case is just so haunting because what should have been a relatively straightforward body recovery mission ended up being, anything but that. A man went into one of the most dangerous underwater caves in Florida. Experienced divers went in after him. They searched for weeks. They found tanks. They found questions and contradictions, but they never found Ben. Hell, they didn't even find any trace that he had even been down there in the first place, which left his family with literally zero answers. And so maybe he's still hidden somewhere in that cave where no one can reach him. Maybe his disappearance has nothing to do with the cave at all. I don't know. But after 16 years, to me, the most unsettling part is that this entire story boils down to this. Ben McDaniel went down into Vortex Spring. He ignored the most ominous warning sign in existence, probably, and then he never came back. And so may he rest in peace. And my heart goes out to his poor parents, man. Please show them some love in the comments, some love to Ben as well. I always appreciate it when you guys do that. And if you're a new viewer here, I really hope I earn your subscription. I tried my best, and YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy this video next. So give it a click, and I'll see you over there.